All right, let me begin with a brief commercial, if I may. Starting in just a couple weeks, 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be starting another elective in the theology program with yours truly as instructor / discussion leader. We're going to be doing a course on the historical Jesus, something that I actually know a little bit about, perhaps compared to some of the science. And looking forward to doing that. We'll be spending 10 weeks, not our usual 9, but we'll go the entire 10 weeks of the term because there's just so much to cover, and I really think this is a subject that is impossible to exaggerate its importance. So we're going to do a 10-week series starting September 15th. My understanding is that the scheduled time for this class will be from 7:30 to 9 Eastern Time. That's 6:30 to 8 Central. Instead of our usual starting at 9 or 10 o'clock at night Eastern, we're going to start a little earlier. And as I said, my understanding is we'll do that from 7:30 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. The course will not be based on putting Jesus in his place. I see somebody asking about that. That book is really a book on Christology, on the doctrine of Christ as deity. We will touch on that issue in one session of the course, so that book will have some relevance for that one session. But mainly we're going to be focusing on historical questions regarding the life of Jesus, looking at the whole historical Jesus controversy. What can we know about the man Jesus? What can we know about what he did, what he said, what he taught, why he died, what events led up to that event, and look at some of the revisionist theories that are currently floating about in academia and in popular culture regarding who Jesus was and what he was all about. We'll look at what the skeptics are saying about Jesus. We'll look at what liberals are saying about Jesus. You know, there's been 2 books at least written in the last few years with the title Jesus Was a Liberal. So we'll be looking at that issue a little bit. We're going to be looking at what New Agers and other mystics have to say about Jesus, their attempts to reinterpret Jesus as one of them. And what has often been said about man making God in his own image is also true about Jesus, that people are often make Jesus in their own image. And we'll see lots of examples of that. So I'm looking forward to that particular class. We'll have a syllabus ready, hopefully by next week, at least a week ahead of time. I already have the basic outline of the course done, and so we'll make that available as soon as possible, and I'll perhaps have a little bit more to say about that in our final class session for this course, which will be next Tuesday night. And we'll have one of the things that I'll provide is a list of suggested readings, as I always do, and hopefully some resources online for that as well. So that's what's coming up. Really looking forward to that course. That might be the favorite one for myself personally of the ones that I've had opportunities to teach here with the theology program. I think I'm going to look forward to that, enjoy that perhaps even more than all the others, and I've enjoyed all of them. So I'm looking forward to that. Well, tonight we're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about various evidences and arguments for and against evolution. My attempt here is going to be to educate, not indoctrinate. I'm not going to just present kind of a propaganda piece for one particular point of view. I'll try to present the evidence and some of the different perspectives on that evidence in as even-handed a manner as possible. I don't have all the answers. I don't know all the answers to all the possible questions. But I will share with you what I have learned so far on this subject. And I've learned an awful lot just preparing for tonight, I have to tell you. So please bear with me as we go through this. The format, as always, will be I will blabber on for 45 minutes to an hour or so, give you my perspective, and hopefully it'll make some sense. And then I will open up for discussion. Those of you who are part of the theology program and taking this course as part of that program will be given priority in asking questions or raising points for discussion. To keep your comments or questions brief. And those of you who are not part of the course, as time permits, will certainly be invited to do that as well. So that's where we're going here. Now, there really are two arguably distinct topics that I want to touch on here or speak about here tonight. One is the origin of life, and the other is the origin of species. Now, depending on who's talking about this and in what context they're talking about this, one will find people often combining these two issues, treating them as of a piece, or one will find people insisting on a clear separation of these two issues. The origin of life question has to do with how did life emerge on the earth in the first place? How did you get from a situation in which there was no life on planet Earth to a situation in which there was some life, whatever type, the first life form to show up on Earth? How did it get there? Then the other question has to do with the diversity of life that we find on the Earth, not only in its present diversity, but its diversity of the past, living things that were here and aren't anymore, and living things that are here are quite diverse. How did they all get here in these diverse forms? How did we get plants and animals? How did we get invertebrates and vertebrates? How did we get cows and ducks and flowers of different kinds? How did we get monkeys and even human beings? I'm not going to say too much today about human origins because we'll spend our last class session next week focusing on that issue. But some of what I have to say tonight will have some bearing on the question of human evolution. All right, so why are these issues sometimes linked and sometimes not? Well, if you are a naturalist, if you are a thoroughgoing naturalist, whether methodological or metaphysical naturalist, someone who insists that all explanations in science must be natural, then you're going to need a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life and a naturalistic explanation for its diversity. And so you'll need a naturalistic explanation for both. Obviously, that's a commonality in the discussion. If you are a theist who believes that God created life by a supernatural act or supernatural intervention in the world, and that he created different kinds of living things separately in special creations, then you see both of these as having miraculous or supernatural implications or origins. And so, again, they would be linked in that way. Not everybody links them in these ways. There are people who will say, well, I can concede that God supernaturally introduced life into the world, but perhaps after that he allowed it to evolve into the multitudinous forms that we see today. And so that's a possible view. One could be a theistic evolutionist and maintain that life did not evolve from non-life, but that various living things evolved from a common ancestor. So there are a variety of viewpoints on these two subjects. Now, I would say this, just giving you kind of a general perception on my part, and my viewpoint isn't the only one here, but my general perception of the situation, the lay of the land in terms of the intellectual discussions and debates going on about these things today, would be as follows, that the origin of life question has the naturalists on the run, but that the origin of species question has the creationists on the run. In other words, the evidence for a supernatural origin of life is beginning to mount, And the naturalists are getting a little bit either anxious or perturbed and simply insisting with a wave of their hand that no supernatural explanation should be entertained for the origin of life, and basically say, trust us, we'll figure it out eventually. So that it's the naturalist who is on the defensive with regards to the origin of life. I'm not claiming that the naturalist will admit that, but that seems to be the case, that naturalists are on the defensive with regard to the origin of life. On the other hand, creationists, theists who maintain belief in a fairly conservative reading of Genesis and who believe in some kind of special creation of whatever form of special creation that might be, whatever theory or variety of that theory might be, I would say in recent years they have been put on the defensive because the apparent evidence for evolution has been mounting. And a lot of the difficulties that evolutionary theory faced in previous generations of the debate have now been apparently solved, and new evidences have arisen that have been, let's say, difficult to explain, at least for many creationists to explain, perhaps not giving, in some cases, a very satisfactory answer. So, on the one hand, if you're a theist, there's cause for rejoicing, if you will, in that the evidence that the origin of life can't be explained naturalistically is mounting. Whereas if you're, again, a theist, you're a creationist, there is some cause for concern in that the evidence for evolution appears to be mounting, so much so that many of the leaders of the so-called intelligent design movement quietly admit some form of evolution. William Dembski, who is clearly the intellectual leader of the intelligent design movement, has stated that his issue is not so much with evolution as with a naturalistic interpretation of evolution that ignores the necessity of intelligent design behind what we see as the result of this evolutionary process. I don't know that Dembski would be willing to be called a theistic evolutionist, but there's a hair's breadth of difference between his view and theistic evolution, if there is a difference. And I'm not presuming to speak for him, and there probably are some limits to what Dembski would acknowledge as happening in evolution. But nevertheless, that's the kind of statement that intelligent design theorists are sometimes making. So that those observers are correct who say that intelligent design is a movement right now that bridges or spans across or spills across or overlaps both evolutionism and creationism. There are intelligent design theorists who are creationists, and there are intelligent design theorists who are evolutionists. Okay, so those are some general observations about the lay of the land. Now let me talk briefly about why the issue of the origin of life has got the naturalist on the run, and then talk about evolution. The basic reason why the origin of life is turning out to be such a problem for naturalists is that the simplest forms of life exhibit such a high degree of specified complexity of apparent design, even at the simplest level, the cellular level, or, if you will, the molecular level even, with DNA, that it is becoming really impossible to make a case for this happening by some kind of strictly natural, unguided process. Now, Dembski, who is, I just mentioned, the intellectual leader of the intelligent design movement, has developed an approach, a methodology for detecting evidence of design, for basically filtering out only apparent examples of design from actual evidences of design. And this explanatory filter, by the way, is laid out for you in a graphic form in my outlines and notes material, which is available to those of you who have been taking this course as part of the theology program on page 30. But anybody who's interested in this, I'm sure can find this information online with a little bit of searching by looking for Dembski, D-E-M-B-S-K-I, and the words explanatory filter. And the basic idea here, to get right down to it, is when you've got complex traits or complex features in nature, the complexity alone does not prove design. If something is complex, all that really tells you is that there's some kind of it's not simple. That's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you how it got to be complex. You can have something be very complex and not be intentionally ordered that way or designed. But when you've got this complex trait characterized by a kind of specificity, that's not just a happenstance kind of complexity, but that there's something that is being specified, some instruction, some information. Information here might be the best way of describing this specificity. Something is being conveyed that has purpose or direction or intent, that actually does something of interest. Then that's an example of what he would call specified complexity. And what does that look like? Well, some examples that I use, I think help. These are simple examples, but I think they help illustrate the idea. We can distinguish three kinds of situations here, three scenarios, only one of which would be evidence of design. The first scenario would be a highly ordered system, very structured, but also very simple, not complex. For example, if you saw the letters B-E, 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 just repeated over and over, B, 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 that is a highly ordered system, but it's not particularly complex. Now you say, well, the word B is in there. In fact, it's in there many times. Yes, but B, finding the letters B and E next to each other, even many times, is not evidence of any kind of thoughtfulness or intelligence or purposiveness. That's a little complicated word there. It's not evidence of somebody actually trying to communicate anything. In fact, if you look at B, 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 it does not appear to be saying anything at all. In a card game, in a bridge hand, for example, if you got dealt all of the hearts in the deck, 2 through ace, that would be astounding, but it wouldn't be. In a bridge hand, you might suspect that somebody dealt the cards that way on purpose, but in fact, it's just one of the many bridge hands that can be dealt, and you might just be one of those 1 in a million individuals who got a bridge hand with every heart in the deck or every spade in the deck. That's a highly ordered set or system, but it's not a complex system. You just happen to have 2 through ace in your hand of the same suit. So if you look at one of these, it could be intentional, but it might not be. You don't really know. And that's the point. There's no evidence here of intelligence. It's not a lack. It doesn't prove a lack of intelligence, doesn't prove lack of design, just you don't know. The second scenario is one in which you have a highly complex system or set, but it's not ordered. My example with words or letters was of highly ordered but not complex was B, 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 which is kind of boring and very simple. Well, what if I had the letters O, E, I, N, B, R, M, W, T, M, E, N, S, Y, A, O, B, A, M, R? You would say, well, that's very complex. The chances of getting those letters, those precise letters in that precise order are 1 in a gazillion. But it doesn't mean anything, so it doesn't prove anything. There's all kinds of combinations that are equally rare, going back to the lottery example we talked about last week, but they're not evidence of intentionality. The fact that you win the lottery doesn't prove that somebody intended for you to win it personally. It just somebody was going to win it. And this particular random jumble of letters that I just spouted off doesn't mean anything, and therefore doesn't prove anything in terms of design or intention. Likewise, if you got a particular bridge hand that you'd never seen before, you got 3 hearts and 4 spades and so forth, and they were in no particular order, you might not ever see that particular bridge hand again, and there is a 1 in a million chance of you ever getting it again, but because it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't prove anything. You would not say, you know, I've never seen this hand before, obviously someone cheated and dealt me this particular group of cards. No, because it could have been another equally random looking group of cards that would be just as unlikely to get, but there it is. So this is not evident. These kinds of situations in which you have a high degree of complexity, but no meaningful order, those are also not evidences of design or evidences against design. They just don't prove anything. Now here is an example of a highly ordered and meaningful complex system. All right, here are the letters: MYNAME, Now those letters spell, my name is Robert Bowman. If you ran across that series of letters anywhere, you would know immediately that there was some kind of intentionality, some kind of mind that produced that order. You would not say, well, any group of letters is equally as possible to show up as any other group of letters, so there's no reason to think that the letters that spell out my name is Robert Bowman are evidence of design, but that would be silly. Anybody running across such a group of letters would immediately infer that there was a person on the other end. Likewise, when those scientists who are engaged in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence search the outer space for messages from outer space, they are operating on the assumption that if they got one, it would be evidence of an intelligent species out there that was sending the message. So, for example, if they picked up a radio transmission from Alpha Centauri that said, WECOMEINPEACE, we come in peace, the scientists would jump up and down and say, we found them, they're coming. They wouldn't say, well, that's just a random happenstance. They would assume or infer, it's not really an assumption, it's a legitimate inference, that the letters spelling out we come in peace were intended to spell out that meaningful message. So that's an example of a highly ordered or highly specific and meaningfully complex set or system. Now, I haven't even talked about life yet, but I think you see where I'm going. DNA is an example of a highly ordered and meaningfully complex system. DNA creates a set of instructions like in a cookbook, only much more complex than in a cookbook, for producing the right biochemical combinations of molecules into living things. It's an incredibly complex and incredibly specific, meaningful set of directions for making a living thing. Even for making such a simple living thing as a protozoan, a single-celled organism, or a rose, let alone a human being. So this is the kind of evidence that has the naturalists on the run. This is why some evolutionists, when they argue for evolution, actually in recent years have said, I don't even want to talk about the origin of life. That's a different issue. That's the issue of of the genesis of life. I only want to talk about the development of the different species of life once you get life here. Well, that's a strategic move, but if you're a naturalist, you have to defend both. Now, again, there are theistic evolutionists who don't believe in a natural origin of life, and that's fine. I'm simply saying that if you're a naturalist, if you're not a theist, this is a problem for you. All right, now I'm going to talk about evolution. I'm going to spend more time on this. And again, my intention here is to give kind of an overview of this subject and the pros and cons from different perspectives. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at various evidences that are commonly presented for evolution and try to give you some idea of how three different groups of people respond to this evidence. The first group would be evolutionists. And generally speaking, this would include theistic evolutionists, but the emphasis here would be on the naturalists. But in fairness, evolutionists, including evolutionists who are more or less in the ID camp, the intelligent design camp, would come up with the same inferences from these evidences, from these facts. So evolutionists would be the first category, the first camp that we'll consider. The second camp would be old Earth creationists. And again, the boundaries between these groups and intelligent design are fuzzy and overlapping. So we'll look at how old Earth creationists assess this evidence that we're going to talk about, and then we'll also talk about how young Earth creationists assess the evidence, what their response to these facts what their response is to these facts. All right, and in putting it out this way, it rigs the game a little bit in favor of the evolutionists because we're really focusing on the evidence, or at least the alleged evidence for evolution. That is, we're focusing on the facts that evolutionists cite in favor of their view. So that puts a little bit of a burden of refutation on the other camps, which is fine for the purposes of this particular exercise. But we could try to talk about the evidences that have been adduced by creationists, old Earth and young Earth, against evolution. We'll touch on some of that along the way because, in fact, some of the same facts get cited on both sides in support of their views. But for the most part, we're looking at the arguments for evolution and how old Earth and young Earth creationists respond to those evidences. There's something of a logic of the order in which I'm going to address these, but it's not an absolute order, and I'm not pretending that I've addressed, or I may not even have time to address all of the arguments, but I'm going to address a good number of them as time permits, so that you get a flavor for how these issues are addressed from these three different points of view. All right, so here we go. Fact number one, the commonalities in physiology in different living things. For example, this is what are known as homologous traits. That is, traits that are common in very different kinds of living things. For example, all vertebrates, their backbones basically follow a similar plan, if you will, and plan may be prejudicial, but everybody uses that kind of term here in this context. That is, backbones basically are structured in the same way, whether you're talking about a human being, a chimpanzee, a giraffe, a dog, etc., etc. Even if we're talking about a salamander or any vertebrate, there's a basic plan or basic structure with some modifications, of course, from one species or one group of animals to another. But there's a lot of similarity. Furthermore, there's a lot of similarities between traits or homologous, what are called these homologous parts that have different functions. For example, the arm of a mammal and the wing of a bird very often are structured with similar bones and arranged in a similar order and structure. They follow a similar parallel kind of plan. They're not exactly the same, of course, but they're often very similar. Now, for the purposes of what we're doing here, of course, I am trying to keep this as non-technical and layman-friendly as possible. Besides, that's about the level at which I understand it. So that's what we're trying to do here, is trying to keep it fairly simple, but some of this stuff will be kind of technical. Now, the evolutionist understands these commonalities as evidence of common descent. They will argue all vertebrates evolved from an original ancestor that was the first vertebrate. The first animal with a backbone is the granddaddy or the grandma of all vertebrates. Even though that ancestor's backbone may have been different from all the backbones that we see in living in vertebrates today, it would be the ancestral backbone and the ancestral organism of all vertebrates. Now, creationists, both old Earth and young Earth creationists, see these commonalities not as evidence of common ancestry or common descent, but as evidence of unitary design. In other words, God says, I like using this particular structure, I'll reuse it over and over and over again, and that's fine. I don't have a problem reusing the same structure many times. One of the objections that creationists give to this argument from commonality in physiology is that these common traits are not always regarded in evolutionary thought as indicating common descent. Specifically in cases of so-called convergent evolution. That's where you've got organisms that are supposedly far from one another on the evolutionary tree, but they have similar traits that the evolutionist ends up concluding evolved independently. So you've got flying squirrels and you've got sugar gliders that both glide using a very similar structure. It's not exactly wings, it's not exactly regular arms, it's something in between with kind of flaps of skin that are able to allow the little animal to glide. And the evolutionist says the squirrels and the sugar gliders evolved these gliding traits, this functionality to allow them to glide from tree to tree or from tree down to the ground. They evolved these independently. Well, if those kinds of traits can evolve independently, why can't vertebrates have received their vertebrate structures independently? In other words, doesn't this kind of undermine the argument from homology? All right, so that's the first one. Let's go to the second one, the universality of the biochemistry of life, the fact that all living things have the same DNA, basic elements, the same types of materials from which living things are made. And there's just there's just various permutations with the DNA that make them be different things, different species, etc. But the building blocks of all living things are the same. Well, evolutionists view this as a very powerful evidence for a common descent of all living things from one primordial ancestor that had that DNA. Again, creationists, both old Earth and young Earth creationists, view this universality of biochemistry as evidence of unitary design. One designer, one creator, using the same building blocks for all of his living things. Just as a writer would use the same letters to produce numerous books and articles, very different from one another, but using the same letters over and over and over again, and even many of the same words over and over again, and he is the mind behind all of those, then the argument goes, God, the creator, could have done the same thing using the same building blocks to produce all these different living things. And of course, again, even if you were to concede the evolutionary inference from this, there would still be evidence of a creator, because the information-rich content of biochemistry is evidence for an intelligent designer. Another fact to be considered, and this is kind of the cutting-edge evidence of the day. I mean, this is the evidence that has been touted for the last several years as the most compelling evidence for evolution, are what are called pseudogenes. Pseudogenes, sometimes referred to as junk DNA, actually junk DNA is a broader term. Pseudogenes are parts of our DNA system that appear to be non-functional. They don't do what they normally do in other animals. And these pseudogenes basically are inactive or non-functional from a cookbook point of view. It's like blank paper in a cookbook. And the most famous example of this, these pseudogenes, has to do with the fact that human beings and chimpanzees and monkeys and other simians and guinea pigs, by the way, do not have all of the genetic instructions to process vitamin C from simple sugar. And so that's why chimpanzees and human beings need to eat a lot of fruit. They need to get vitamin C directly from their food, in food that already has the vitamin C processed and ready to be processed in the body, rather than having to get it through some kind of chemical process from simple sugar. Well, simians and humans both have the same pseudogene called pseudo-GLO, and that's the simple form of that name. And the fact that simians, like, again, chimpanzees and monkeys, have the same pseudogene as human beings, and in fact, in some respects, the same exact blank page, if you will, in their cookbook as in ours, would seem to be very powerful evidence that simians and human beings have a common ancestor from which we got the same pseudogene. That's the argument. Now, this looks like a really good argument, but there's a couple of problems. First of all, it turns out that a lot of the pseudogenes that scientists originally thought had no function at all turns out to have some functionality. There have been experiments done where a particular pseudogene that was thought to have no importance at all to an organism was interfered with on purpose to see what would happen, and the animal died. Well, whoops, apparently it needed that for something after all. Then there's interesting counter evidence against this specific argument with regard to the genetic instructions for making vitamin C being missing from simians and human beings. I mentioned that it's also missing from guinea pigs. Now, here's what's fascinating. If it's missing from guinea pigs and simians and human beings, then you would expect that all of the creatures that are descended from the common ancestor of guinea pigs, simians, and human beings, they would all have the same pseudogene. But they don't. In fact, there is a category of they're the prosimians, which is the other branch of the family that we're supposed to be part of, along with the monkeys and chimps. There's another group of animals called prosimians that are supposed to be our distant cousins, that are supposedly have a common ancestor with simians, including us. Those prosimians don't have the pseudogene. They they are able to make vitamin C from simple sugar. But guinea pigs have the pseudogene, and in this respect, it looks like, if you take an evolutionary approach, it looks like guinea pigs are more closely related to human beings than the prosimians are, which is not possible from an evolutionary perspective. So the fact that the guinea pigs are also missing the pseudogene, and in some very specific details paralleling the genetic code of human beings on this particular business about making this particular enzyme to process vitamin C, is evidence against the claim that the pseudogene must be evidence of common ancestry. Because if it were, you'd expect the prosimians also to be in that same situation, which they're not. I hope that made sense. This is a pretty complicated issue, but it turns out that the evidence is not as clear-cut for evolution as evolutionists present it to be. Now, what looks like, I think, at least on a surface level, very powerful evidence for evolution has to do with the geological column. This is the historical progression of organisms in the geological column from simple to complex, such that the organisms that are higher up in the geological column, closer to the surface of the Earth, more recent layers of dirt, if you will, where the fossils are younger, those are the animals that you would expect to be evolved from the animals that are below that level in the geological column. In other words, according to the evolutionary model, for example, birds evolved from dinosaurs. Well, for that to be the case, you'd expect birds to show up higher in the geological column, closer to the present for the first time, and not before the dinosaurs. And right now that appears to be holding. The birds appear in the fossil record later in time than the dinosaurs. And all the way up the geological column, this basically works. If you had, for example, muskrats showing up in rocks older than the oldest fish, that would be a real problem for evolution. But you don't have that. The geological column is consistent with an evolutionary model of the history of life. And it, at least in terms of that consistency or coherence with evolution, is regarded by evolutionists as powerful evidence for that conclusion. Now, old Earth creationists and young Earth creationists up until this point in my discussion have been on the same page. Here they part company. Young Earth creationists believe that this progression from simpler to more complex life forms in the geological column is illusory, because they believe the geological column was almost entirely laid down in a 1-year period of time at Noah's flood. And in fact, much of the evidence for evolution, young Earth creationists explain by resorting to the global flood. If you believe that the Bible teaches a global flood, and you believe that the global flood would have the kind of effects that the young Earth creationists say it would, this begins to be plausible as an explanation. But you have to have those two things in place, and you've got to believe the evidence, the geological evidence, would support it. But in any case, this is how young Earth creationists deal with much of the evidence for evolution, is to say it only looks that way, and evolution, though, rests on a mistake because, in fact, this was caused by the flood. The obvious difficulty, and I'm not saying young Earth creationists haven't tried to address this, but the obvious difficulty is the apparent overly convenient fact that the organisms are arranged in this column from the simplest at the bottom to the most complex, the most highly ordered, and the apparently most evolved at the top. That's a little difficult to explain if it's the global flood just throwing all the animals and plants hither and yon in big upheavals you wouldn't expect that kind of neat ordering. And yet that is, generally speaking, what we find. Now, old Earth creationists have a somewhat different answer. In fact, it's a very different answer. They acknowledge the fact of the geological column and the fact that the organisms in the fossil record are ordered in this way, but they have a different explanation. Their explanation is that the habitats of the more complex organisms depend on the presence of the less complex organisms. In other words, if you want to have mammals having a nice place to live, you've got to have plants, you've got to have insects, you've got to have frogs and things like that. You've got to have simpler forms of life to have the rich kind of balanced habitat for the mammals to run around and play in and live in. In fact, in some cases, to eat. That you've got to have the smaller and more easily conquered animals running around in order for the mammals to have something to eat if they're carnivores. So that would be how an old Earth creationist typically would explain the geological column. Now, continuing on with the fossil record, there is the discovery of what evolutionists regard as transitional forms in the fossil record. And by transitional forms, we mean here fossils of organisms that are not neatly categorized as either, say, fish or amphibians or reptiles or birds, but something in between that could be regarded as evidence that there was a continuum from one order to the next. Two famous examples of this would be Archaeopteryx, which, depending on who you read, is a reptile with bird-like features, a bird with reptilian features, or something that was neither a reptile nor a bird. I think the evolutionists in general regard Archaeopteryx as a reptile that had some bird-like features. The other one, which is an even more interesting one, is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is an organism that appears to be an amphibian, a fish that has some amphibian qualities, some amphibian traits, and it is regarded as a kind of transitional form between fish and amphibians. Now, the Tiktaalik story is a very interesting one because it is a case of scientists predicting that a particular transitional form, a particular kind of transitional form must exist in a certain kind of location and in a specific period of time in the geological column, going out and looking for it and apparently finding it. The story is that what they did was they said, well, you've got fish so many millions of years ago, you've got amphibians 30 or 40 million years after that. We ought to find a transitional form between these two, and it ought to be in some kind of a freshwater environment. Let's look on the map and see if we can find a place where people have not already been digging for years to look for something, and let's go there and let's look for it. So they found a freshwater lake area in the Arctic in Canada, went there and searched for a few years, and they found Tiktaalik, which was basically the kind of thing that they were looking for. At least that's what they say. And so this was a discovery that was predicted in advance, and scientists love to be able to make predictions and have them turn out to be true because it demonstrates the power of the hypothesis or the theory. One of the main boasts of science is that it makes predictions that can be tested. And in this case, the prediction was borne out because they actually went looking for a kind of transitional form and found it. Well, for evolutionists, these transitional forms are powerful evidence of common descent. Archaeopteryx demonstrates that birds did in fact evolve from dinosaurs, from reptiles, and that amphibians evolved from fish. Now, the young Earth creationists dismiss this kind of evidence on the grounds that it assumes the validity of the dates for these different fossils. And, of course, they reject these millions of years dates for these various fossils. But they also make other criticisms of these arguments that old Earth creationists would also make. For example, usually, in fact, pretty much always, it is the case that these heralded transitional forms are not actual common ancestors. For example, Archaeopteryx is not an ancestor of modern birds. I don't think there are any scientists who are claiming the Archaeopteryx is a reptilian ancestor of modern birds. What they're saying is it shows that there was a transitional period during which you had some organisms that were reptilian but with increasingly bird-like features. Well, that's nice, but it's not really proof of evolution. What you really want is the ancestor of birds with reptilian features. And you don't have that. The same thing with Tiktaalik. Nobody is claiming that Tiktaalik is the ancestor of modern amphibians. They're claiming that it is an example of the kind of organism you would find in that intermediate period. Well, it could be then that the apparent linear direct line, the apparent linear order from fish to amphibians or from reptiles to birds is an illusion. And one of the problems here is that the fossil record may not be representative of the facts. According to the evolutionists' own estimates, we now have discovered some 250,000 different species in fossilized form. That is, about 250,000 different fossilized species have been cataloged. That's a lot, isn't it? Well, not really. Not when it turns out that scientists estimate there are 10 million or more species of animals and plants alive today, and that there would have been a whole lot more, probably 1 billion or more in the past, that are no longer alive. That means that our fossil record that we actually have, the fossils that we've cataloged, account for only about, on the order of, this is not an exact figure, on the order of 0.1% of the species that have lived on the Earth. And it might be 1/100th of 1%. Well, is that a representative sample? Gallup and Zogby would say no. They would say you don't have anything close to a representative sample. And what scientists are doing with the geological column and with these transitional forms in drawing these, these charts and these tables, the tree of life, they're doing a lot of interpolation. They're doing a lot of connecting the dots where you don't have enough information to be confident that the dots should be drawn in the straight lines that the scientists are drawing it. So, in other words, they're reading between the lines here, but the lines are miles apart. And that raises some questions about the validity of the inferences that the scientists are drawing. Now, moving along to other evidences, and obviously I'm giving you a very brief overview of these evidences and these arguments. We could spend a lot of time on any one of these. The distribution of fossils throughout the world shows some interesting patterns. For example, there's a particular fossilized tree species known as Glossopteris. I should have practiced that one. Glossopteris. That is only found, the scientists have only found these fossils at the south end of South America, in Antarctica, one little part of Antarctica, in Australia, and in the southern tip of India. Now, why is Glossopteris found in these very far removed locations and nowhere else. Well, it turns out that those far off locations once were in the same general vicinity because of continental drift. Now, if you're not familiar with this idea, the idea is that at one time in Earth's history, hundreds of millions of years ago, all of the continents were joined together in one supercontinent that gradually broke apart and split into the various continents that we see today, and that they drifted further and further apart over the millions of years. In fact, they're still drifting apart. We are able to watch the continents drift apart from one another from space with our satellites and measure, how many inches a year the continents are moving each, as we watch it. We've actually been able to observe it directly. So it's not a guess at this point. The continents are drifting, they are moving. And if you've ever looked at a map of the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, if you've ever looked at a map, you've probably noticed that the bulge on the eastern side of South America would fit nicely into the hollow on the western side of Africa. Why is that? Well, because they were once joined at that particular place. They were once joined at the hip there, if you will. And it turns out that South America, the southern part of South America, Antarctica, the southern tip of India, and the southern region of Africa were all once basically joined together, and that's where this particular fossilized tree was located, was in that particular region of that massive supercontinent. Now, this evidence is extremely important to evolution, not, though, as proof that evolution occurred, but as solving a very serious problem for evolution. Because obviously, you can't have Glossopteris evolving independently on 4 different continents. How do you explain that? Well, it turns out it evolved, according to the evolutionists, on one continent, and then when that continent split up, it carried over into those different locations. So, continental drift solves a very serious problem for evolutionary theory, one that Darwin recognized, and evolutionists in Darwin's day proposed that there had once been land bridges connecting these continents, so that there would have been some kind of land bridge going all the way across the South Atlantic from Africa to South America. Darwin himself poo-pooed the idea, rejected it out of hand, said it was silly, but still argued that there must have been some way in the past for these organisms to move across these different continental land masses. Well, now we know how they did it. But this doesn't prove evolution. It just helps explain one aspect of the evidence if you are an evolutionist. Obviously, Glossopteris is the same species regardless of what continent it is found on. Now, another evidence that it's not, it really isn't evidence for evolution, but you could see how it would be from an evolutionist perspective. And that is the fact that it appears now that the vast majority of species in Earth's history, well over 99%, according to the current estimates, maybe over 99.9%, have gone extinct. Again, there's 10 million or more species of animals and plants on the Earth, not even worrying about amoebas and stuff like that. Just plants and animals, there's 10 million or more species of them on the Earth right now. Scientists have no idea how many there used to be, but they're confident that it was something like 1 billion or even a lot more than that. And the evolutionists ask, why would a creator or designer produce so many species that didn't last? Why make billions of species and allow them to go extinct? Apparently they weren't very well designed because they didn't survive. Now, this argument is met by young Earth by the way, I'm sorry, I skipped something here. Young Earth creationists respond to the evidence of continental drift by claiming that it basically took place at the flood, not hundreds of millions of years ago. And but anyway, moving on here. Likewise, young Earth creationists argue that most extinctions that have taken place in Earth's history, however many there might have been, took place in the flood. They do not believe that millions of species went naturally extinct prior to the flood, but that almost all of the extinctions that have taken place in Earth's history took place in that 1 year period of Noah's flood. Now, old Earth creationists, of course, do not take this approach. They argue that the evolutionists is simply here smuggling in a philosophical assumption about what God would do. How do you know that a creator would design species only to have them last throughout Earth's history? Why not let God do whatever he wants to do? Now, there are various estimates on this, but the typical animal or plant on the Earth's surface, that species will live on the Earth for a few million years, 2 to 4 million years, some less and some more. And, that's not forever in Earth history at all, of course, but isn't that a fairly long time? I mean, what is it that would obligate God to create species only for them to last throughout Earth's history? Where is that assumption written? How do you know what God would or would not do in that regard? The extinction issue is actually something that can be turned around against the evolutionist and used as evidence against a naturalistic interpretation of the origin of species, because not only have species come and gone in fairly natural, terrestrial, ordinary fashions of just not being able to survive the competition or something, but there have been at least 5 major mass extinction events in Earth's history in the past 500 million years, according to the conventional geological studies. The most recent of these is a very famous mass extinction event that took place about 65 million years ago. Most scientists think, not all, but most scientists think that this was caused by an asteroid impacting the Earth, probably in Central America, and this is the event that is thought to be the cause of the extinction of the dinosaurs. Well, this is a problem, actually, if you're an evolutionist, because it means that natural processes have to gin up the evolutionary process and produce more species every 50 to 100 million years after one of these mass extinction events. I mean, the extinction event that took place 65 million years ago didn't just wipe out the dinosaurs. Scientists estimate it wiped out about 75% of all species on the Earth. Another extinction event that happened hundreds of millions of years earlier than that is thought to have wiped out over 90% of all species living at that time. So you've got a problem of life having to be sort of engineered by natural selection several times just in the past 500 million years. Now, you may think 500 million years is a long time, but not for evolutionists. Evolutionists need lots and lots of time to have these evolutionary processes do their work. I see that I'm really running out of time here, but let me try to touch on a couple of other evidences. Similar to what I've just brought up, evolutionists often point to suboptimal designs, that is, apparent designs in living things that aren't as good as they could be, as evidence that they weren't produced by a designer. An intelligent designer, according to this argument, wouldn't have done things this way. For example, Indian rhinoceroses, have just one horn, whereas African rhinos have 2. Well, 2 horns are better than 1. Why didn't the Creator give the Indian rhino 2 horns? Why did he give him just 1? Most vertebrates, I think it's all vertebrates, including human beings, may have marvelous eyes, but the eyes have blind spots as a result of what evolutionists describe as a suboptimal arrangement in the eye. those blind spots can get you killed by an animal that rushes you from the side. Now, there are other examples of suboptimal designs, but what do you say about these? Well, if you're an evolutionist, you say that these suboptimal designs are evidence against a designer and evidence for natural selection, because natural selection must work with whatever is available. The African rhino, the Indian rhino, evolved just one horn because whatever the Indian rhino evolved from only had that one place on the head that could give rise to that particular development of a horn. And so that's evidence for natural selection and evidence against designer. Now, in response to this, creationists, first of all, suggest that these apparent suboptimal designs may have undetected benefits. For example, the arrangement of the eye that causes us to have blind spots also causes our eyes to be protected from ultraviolet radiation. Well, that's a pretty good trade-off. I mean, I'll take the blind spot and have my eyes last a little longer, or a lot longer, by being protected from ultraviolet radiation. There are other points that creationists make. Young Earth creationists tend to argue that some of these, in fact, most of these suboptimal traits may be the result of the fall. In other words, the animals aren't as good as they could have been because there's been a corruption of nature as a result of the fall. Old Earth creationists do not take this approach. They very rarely would appeal to the fall as evidence or explanations for suboptimal designs, except perhaps with human beings. I don't know if that's consistent or not, but just raise that as a question for further reflection. Another point that old Earth creationists would make here is that organisms with so-called optimal designs might be better off for themselves, but worse off for the habitat as a whole. For example, an organism that has an absolutely superior set of specs might be too aggressive and too successful in wiping out competitors and in killing off other organisms. Having organisms be less than optimally designed may be better for the biosphere as a whole, for the habitat as a whole. And of course, the fact that these traits, though they are not optimal in some kind of perfect way, are extremely efficient, extremely successful, creationists of all stripes would argue is evidence for a designer, even if the designer chose not to make these optimal according to the evolutionists' preferences. I really only have time for one more, and there is other evidence here that needs to be discussed, but maybe some of you will bring that up. Actually, there's two pieces of evidence here I'll present quickly together, and this has to do with the distribution of animals on islands. On oceanic islands like the Galapagos Islands or Hawaii, there is an abundance of insects and birds, and almost no mammals, no reptiles, no amphibians, and no freshwater fish on oceanic islands like the Hawaiian Islands. But you do find these different kinds of animals on continental islands like the British Isles or the Japanese islands, the islands of Japan. Now, furthermore, on these oceanic islands, they become kind of intense laboratories of natural selection and evolution, according to the evolutionists, because you have the diversity of species run wild on these islands. On the Galapagos Islands, there are an amazing variety of finches, little birds called finches, that are of different species. They have different looking beaks that enable the birds to eat different kinds of organisms on the separated islands in that chain of islands. There are about 2,000 species of fruit flies on the earth. Half of those are found only in the Hawaiian Islands. There's 1,000 different species of fruit flies on the Hawaiian Islands. That gives some evolutionary scientists a career just cataloging and examining fruit flies in Hawaii. That's a lot of diversification of species in these remote locations. Well, the evolutionist thinks that these evidences from the oceanic islands proves that the organisms got to those islands from continents. Because notice, the animals that get there are the kind of animals that could arrive there from continents. Birds could fly there, for example, and other plants could float there, the seeds could float there on the waters, etc., etc. But freshwater fish can't swim through the salt water of an ocean to get to the Hawaiian Islands. Mammals would have a very difficult time arriving on any of these islands through natural means. They get there when people take them there, but they can't get there on their own. And the fact that you've got all these different species diversifying on these remote islands illustrates natural selection. Now, young Earth creationists will simply say, regarding the distribution of animals, that it's going to be a lot harder for mammals and reptiles to reach these islands or get back to the islands after the global flood. Young Earth creationists have old Earth creationists have no problem accepting this distribution as the way things actually happened originally for these animals. That is, there's no problem from an old Earth creationist perspective acknowledging that this is actually how these organisms reached the islands. But it wouldn't be evidence for evolution. For example, perhaps there's a good reason why mammals don't get created specially and dropped off on the Hawaiian Islands. We have evidence for this, by the way, because when people have taken mammals to these remote islands, like the Hawaiian Islands, those mammals have become ecological menaces. It turns out that if you've got a small chain of remote islands in the middle of the ocean, mammals create havoc. They are menaces. They take over the place in an extreme way. Maybe best for the environment or the habitat as a whole not to have mammals on these islands. And of course, the evidence of evolution by natural selection on these islands is real, but it's limited. In other words, you've got various species of finches on the Galapagos Islands. Great, but finches are finches. You don't have finches evolving into parrots or finches evolving into something else. You don't have fruit flies evolving into bats or something else. You have fruit flies evolving into other kinds of fruit flies. And so it looks like there are limits to evolutionary developments. And of course, selective breeding could be cited as an example of this. Evolutionists cite selective breeding when, for example, humans breed cats to look a certain way for show, or dogs more commonly, or when they breed cows to give more milk and so forth. This shows an analogy to natural selection. And it does, but it only shows as well the limits of selection. Because you can breed cows till the cows come home, but you're always going to have cows. And you're not going to have cows that get as large as elephants. You're not going to have cows that evolve or get bred into something other than cows. You're not going to even have cows that you can I don't think you could ever breed a cow and get a buffalo. So there's limits to breeding, and those illustrate the apparent limits to evolution by natural selection. Well, I apologize if I've skipped your favorite evidence, but I'm going to stop here. I'm going to relinquish the microphone to our moderators and open it up for comments and discussions. Please keep your questions or comments brief and also respectful, polite. Don't shoot the messenger. And we'll have a hopefully interesting discussion here for 20 or 30 minutes or so. Well, I think I pretty much covered most of it. Well, there is something else I'll talk about here. I mentioned convergent evolution, and I need to explain that a little bit more and talk about this with the time that we have. I'll go ahead and do that. Again, the idea of convergent evolution is the idea of having traits that are very similar in widely separated species that they're not closely related evolution in terms of evolutionary ancestry, apparently evolving certain very specific traits independently. In fact, whole organisms that look very, very similar and function in very similar ways are understood by evolutionists to have evolved independently on separate continents, and this is evidence for what they call convergent evolution. Now, I've already raised the problem. If you can have these remarkably similar traits evolving independently, can you then turn around and argue that commonality of traits is evidence of common ancestry or common descent? I don't think you can have it both ways. Logically, if traits like the ability to fly can evolve independently, then vertebrates, backbones could evolve independently, but that ruins the whole argument for common descent. Now, what are some examples of these? Well, you've got cacti in North America. A cactus is a succulent. It's a plant that thrives in the desert. It requires very little water, and it can just thrive in the desert despite the fact that everything else is shriveling up, and we're shriveling up in the heat. Well, there are cacti in North America. They're very similar succulents in the old world called euphorbs. Now, it's EUPHORBS, euphorbs. Now, they work very much the same way. They look almost identical. You could have them side by side, and you might be hard-pressed to tell the difference. One, the sap is clear, and the other it's milky, but other than that, they basically look the same and work the same. And evolutionists think that they evolved independently of one another. Now, some evolutionists anticipate a rebuttal here, which is, well, maybe God knew that even though the deserts in Australia and in North America in the Southwest are very similar habitats, that the cactus would do better in New Mexico than in Australia, and that the euphorbs would do better. Maybe they're subtly different for a reason. That has to do with them being able to do better in one desert than in another. And to that, the evolutionists have a ready response, which is, actually, we can show that that's not the explanation, because cacti were introduced into Australia. And not only did they do really well, they did too well, because they started to multiply and displace the euphorbs there, and they became something of a problem. So apparently cacti would have done just great in Australia. Now, I think this answer actually has within it the answer to the evolutionists' argument, because you could then turn around and argue maybe God didn't put cacti in Australia because he knew they would do too well. Again, the issue is not just the adaptability of that one organism to the habitat, but the balance of life in the habitat of all the organisms that have to share the same environment. And you could argue as a creationist that God created cacti and euphorbs separately in separate desert environments because he knew that they would do too well if switched into the other environments. So the convergence of traits, first of all, argues against the evolutionary argument from homology, from common traits proving common descent, and these similar species in similar habitats may have been designed for these different habitats, not just for their own benefits, but for the benefit of the environment and all of the creatures there at the same time. All right, let me get off again and give one more shot here to those of you that got questions.
Chad asked, how do evolutionists square natural selection as survival of the fittest, and yet when new mammals introduced to an environment do too well and become ecological menaces? Can you be too successful at evolution? Here's how Rob responded.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what their answer would be to this. I think that evolutionists have an interesting bit of double-mindedness on this because they tend to blame this sort of phenomenon on man. But isn't man one of the mammals that inhabits the earth? And why is it that man is uniquely able to mess up the habitats of other organisms in this fashion? I mean, we are responsible for destroying a number of species on Hawaii because we introduced rats. I don't mean we personally, but human beings introduced rats into the Hawaiian Islands. They sailed to Hawaii, they had rats on their boats, and the rats went ashore, and the rats started eating things that didn't know how to defend themselves against the rats. Now, this does, I think, pose a serious problem for the evolutionary theory because, again, it shows that these habitats look like they were designed not to have these kinds of mammals running around in them. And if human beings are so able so easily to upset the balance by, for example, planting cacti in Australia or taking bunny rabbits to Australia, Australia has their own version of rabbits. They're called bilbies. And Westerners took rabbits to Australia, and the rabbits became menaces to the bilbies. So much so now that in Australia they have a campaign to replace the Easter bunny with the Easter bilby. Well, that's because the bunny rabbits do too well in Australia. So I think some of these arguments, they look very powerful on the surface. There are some problems with them, and it's very complicated. To sort all this out is very difficult. There's a lot of information, and there's a lot of unanswered questions for everybody trying to deal with all this evidence.
A visitor in the room, Elvis Prez, asked Rob if he had ever dealt with Francis Collins' challenge to ID and creationism. Collins says the genome data shows many failed mutation and establishes evolution as scientific fact. Here's how Rob responded.
Not sure how failed mutations would help to establish evolution as a scientific fact. The genome data does show things like the pseudogenes and other so-called junk DNA. And I've already mentioned some elements of the response from creationists to this evidence that calls into question whether this is clear-cut evidence for evolution. I would recommend taking a look, for example, at the works of Fuzz Rana of Reasons to Believe. He is a biologist, a biochemist who has studied these issues, and he talks about pseudogenes and the other forms of junk DNA in his books on the cell's design and on Who Was Adam. Talks about it there as well. I've seen some responses to Collins. I can't tell you off the top of my head where that is. If you email me, and the folks here can provide that email address, I can look that up and give you a reference. But Collins is a persuasive advocate for theistic evolution. He's a Christian. He considers himself an evangelical Christian. He likes to quote C.S. Lewis. That's always a plus for most Christians. But at the same time, and Lewis was a theistic evolutionist. But I don't know that Collins's arguments here are airtight. But again, I'm open to the evidence, and I'm still learning. But my perception is that the arguments are not as clear cut as what we're being told.
Jeff asked, why do things only live a certain time and grow to a certain size? Here's how Rob replied.
Jeff, I'm not sure how that sort of phenomenon would count against evolution. So maybe I'm not following your question. I think that in general, evolutionists think that as Earth's history has progressed, the number of species jostling for dominance has increased. There's been more of a balance. You don't have as many humongous animals pounding around on the Earth as there once was. The environment has changed. The habitats have changed, and they are no longer favorable to having several very large organisms pounding around, and lots of little ones, trying to stay out of the way. You now have, on the continents, you now have more of a balance where you don't have a lot of really big animals. So I think that's basically what they would say in very simplistic layman's fashion. So I'm not sure how that would count against evolution. Again, evolutionists would emphasize there have been a lot of extinctions. A lot of animals have come and gone. I don't think that's an argument for evolution either, as I've explained. So I kind of think that on that issue, matters are kind of a wash. I don't think it goes one way or the other.
Tim, a student of the class, stated, "Isn't it a fact that we can learn and improve and adapt to our environment evolutionary proof? A fish in a cave eventually loses sight. Now, this does not mean it turns into a turtle, but it certainly is evolving." Here's how Rob replied.
Sure. Yeah, I think there is a question there. Let's distinguish something here, and I should have done this. I sort of jumped into the issues here without a lot of explanation in advance. What do we mean by evolution? The definition of evolution is basically change over time. If that's the basic definition of evolution, then of course evolution is a fact. Human beings tend to live longer than they did hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. They tend to, their diets are somewhat different. Other living things have changed over time. So change over time is a fact. It's never been disputed. The extent to which there has been change over time, we may have had to acknowledge more of it than what we originally thought. But change over time is a fact. Evolution as a grand theory of the origin of all species from a common ancestor, that's a different matter. That's what people usually mean by evolution, and that is not a fact in the same way that change over time of all living things is a fact. Now, this is often explained in terms of what's called microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution would be changes over time in a population of species where you have some shifts in the general character or general traits of those creatures. For example, you may have over time a lightening of the skin of a particular group of animals, particular species of animals in a particular habitat, where having lighter skin or lighter colored feathers is advantageous in that particular habitat to hide from enemies, for example, from predators. That's microevolution. Macroevolution would be the evolution of completely new traits, completely new features, new forms over time as the result of an accumulation of smaller changes. And so, for example, the idea of amphibians evolving from fish or birds evolving from dinosaurs, that's macroevolution. Now, the boundaries here are kind of fuzzy. Some people define macroevolution as any evolution that results in new species. Well, what is a species? That turns out to be a controversial question, even among evolutionists. One way of defining a species is a group of organisms whose members cannot mate with or reproduce with members of another group. So if you've got two groups of finches and they can't interbreed, you've got two species of finches. Well, okay, that may be one way of defining species, but does that prove macroevolution in the grander scheme of, having anything be possible to evolve from a common ancestor? No, it doesn't. Other people define species genetically. Well, again, what are the limitations of genetic variation, and what kinds of new things can evolve? To what extent can you have innovation through genetic changes? That's something that has yet to be determined with any kind of precision. Sometimes you can have organisms that fit the definition of a different species genetically, but not in terms of mating, or vice versa. So does evolution take place in the technically narrow sense of change of living things over time? Of course it does. Is evolution the explanation for the origin of all species? That's a different question. So I hope that clarifies this. Now, somebody asked, Sampson asked, one of the common criticisms of creationism and of intelligent design is the lack of scientific predictability, is that the lack of any testable predictions from these approaches to origins. And in fact, this criticism, I think, is not really a fair criticism, because at the same time, evolutionists claim that they have found evidence that falsifies creationism and falsifies intelligent design. Well, you can't have it both ways. If creationism expects certain things to be the case and we find evidence to the contrary, that means that creationism has certain predictions inherent in it that turn out to be falsified, at least supposedly, by this newly discovered evidence. Same thing for intelligent design. So I don't buy the claim that creationism and intelligent design don't make predictions. They do make predictions. Now, intelligent design its predictive character is less developed, I would argue, than creationism, because intelligent design is a fairly broad category of opinions, a school of thought that basically says however things came to be, in terms of whether it's evolution or creation, some kind of intelligent design must be behind it. Well, now you can see that if you take that position, you're locked into fewer necessary corollaries or necessary implications of your position, because if it turns out to be evolution, that's consistent as long as it's guided by an intelligent designer. If it turns out to be creationism, fine, because again an intelligent designer is involved. So arguably intelligent design makes fewer concrete or specific predictions, but it does make some predictions. And if you read the literature from intelligent design theorists, they will tell you what some of those are. They have to do with, being able to find certain structures that are what some have called irreducibly complex, where you could not have a plausible pathway for that particular trait to evolve naturalistically. Now, evolutionists dispute this, and if you're extremely creative, you can imagine scenarios where almost anything evolves through a series of intermediate steps. But whether that's actually happened or not is a different question. Again, that's a testable claim that the fossil record might help to confirm or disconfirm. All right, so those are just some thoughts on that particular question as well.
Tim asked another question regarding microevolution. He said, with it occurring over millions of years, wouldn't a small series of change make for a large overall change? Here's how Rob replied.
Well, microevolution has been happening for as long as living things have been on the Earth, but there are limits, I would argue, to what kinds of changes that you're going to get. See, microevolution, and all evolutionists agree with this. Maybe shouldn't say all. Most evolutionists agree with this. That evolution can only produce changes through the input that it gets from the environment and from the genetic material itself, going through whatever kinds of changes it goes through. And these changes have to come through some kind of mechanism. Now, for decades now, the primary mechanism has been held to be mutations. And these are now understood as variations in the genetic code of living things. Now, these genetic variations or mutations are random, but they happen within limits. You cannot have a fruit fly have its genetic code mutate immediately into the genetic code of a human being, for example, or vice versa, even if you're Jeff Goldblum. Okay, so you can't. That doesn't happen, and no scientist thinks that happens. Although early in the 20th century, there were scientists, a few, that suggested that something almost like that might have happened, but that was just a trial balloon that nobody accepted. So there are limits to this. If you've got a population of organisms, you will have some natural variations. You'll have human beings that have blue eyes, that have brown eyes, that have hazel eyes, etc., etc. You're not going to have human beings evolving 6 eyes. You're not going to have human beings evolving telescopes that come out of their eyes, eye sockets, telephoto lenses and things of that nature. There's certain limitations that the genetics operates within. And the only debate is just how conservative is this process? How limited is it? Now, the evolutionist argues that if you accumulate a lot of little changes over millions of years, you can eventually get some big changes. Well, you might be able to get some, but the question is whether you can get all of the kinds of changes coordinated in the way that they have emerged, according to the evolutionary scenario, to make this work. Or, for example, it's not especially unbelievable that wings could evolve from limbs. But it's rather unbelievable that all of the different features of all these different living things have evolved, even with millions of years, because there are certain limitations to what can happen with genetic variations. In fact, gene theory has in some ways called into question Darwinianism, because in Darwinism, the limitations were not seen. Genes have certain specifications, and you can only make changes with what you've got. And I'll give you an analogy here. I don't know if you ever watched the TV game show Lingo, which is on the game show network. Well, in Lingo, you have to guess a word, and you're given a letter at a time. And if it's an 8-letter word, you know it's going to have 8 letters. And you can try different letters, you can try different words, and you eventually figure out what it is. Well, there are certain limitations with that. It can't be a 14-letter word. You don't have the room for a 14-letter word. Well, genes kind of works that way. You can have certain genetic variations, and it can create a lot of interesting changes and variations, but you're not going to have an infinite number of variations possible with the same genetic code, with the same genetic cookbook, as it were. And so there are certain limitations there. Anyway, that's just some general, and again, trying to keep this at a lay level, observations on these questions.
Samson, always weighing in with the heavy theological issues, asked the question, why don't we have tails? He said they would be handy. A commonality question? Let's just see how Rob answers.
The evolutionist would argue that, in fact, we do have tails, or at least we have the remnants of tails. We have a tailbone. And in some human babies are born with a very short tail. which evolutionists regard as a throwback to the days when our ancestors had tails. Now, this, from an evolutionary standpoint, proves common ancestry, common descent. From a creationist perspective, it proves some similarities of design and the possibility of things going a little bit wrong, where we end up with features that we can recognize as similar to features on other animals. But remember, in evolutionary thought, common traits really don't prove common ancestry. They only do when it's convenient to the theory. And that's, I think, a serious objection to this whole line of argument. Now, we have, in other words, there's various ways of interpreting the same data. And the argument is really over the interpretation of the facts, and for the most part, not the facts themselves, although I'd have to seriously or heavily qualify that with regards to young Earth creationism, although, sophisticated young Earth creationists do attempt to do something with all of the factual data that is at hand, but what they do with it is scientifically credible, I think, from my perspective, is questionable, but nevertheless, they also are offering an interpretation of the data. I need to say this just in all fairness. The main reason, I think, why a lot of evolutionists adhere to the evolutionary theory is the, and I'll use the term convergence here again, but now in a different context, the convergence, or they would say sometimes the consilience of all of these lines of reasoning. In other words, it isn't just homology, it isn't just geographical distribution of the animals, it isn't just pseudogenes, it isn't just vestigial organs like wings on birds like ostriches that can't fly, and I didn't even mention that one. It's the fact that all of these things can be elegantly and simply explained on the same model of evolution by natural selection. And that is a powerful feature of the argument. It's the fact that these lines of evidence can be correlated into a very simple, compact, elegant argument or interpretation that correlates the molecular or biochemical evidence with the fossil record and the geographical evidence of the distribution of animals and all of these different things. That's the power of the evolutionary model from an evolutionist standpoint, is that it creates a kind of unifying theory for biology, which is why Dobzhansky made the famous statement, I think it was, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So that's the power of the argument, and I think that that creationists have done a very good job, for the most part, especially in my opinion, and that's reflecting my bias. Old Earth creationists have done a very good job, for the most part, of dealing with the individual arguments or the individual elements of the evidence. They haven't usually done as good a job of dealing with the package of the consilience of these different lines of evidence, all seeming to come together nicely in the theory of evolution. So I do think that we need to do a better job of addressing that. I do think we need to do a better job of presenting an alternate model of origins of species that has an equally powerful coherence and consilience that unifies the evidence in a better way. And here I think that the power of creationism is that it coheres, brings together the evidence of the origin of life with the evidence of the origin of species in a way that does a better job than naturalism. Naturalism, I think, again, seems to make a very powerful case for evolution and common descent through natural selection. But it falters when it comes to the origin of life. And I think potentially at least the creationist approach has, especially in my opinion, again, sorry, this is reflecting my own belief, especially from an old Earth perspective, creationism has the ability to present a more powerful, more comprehensive model of origins that can account for the origin of life as well as the diversity of life in a way that's superior to a purely naturalistic model of unguided, unintelligent processes with no creator or designer orchestrating things. So that's a comment about the big picture here again. And a lot more could be said, but I think we have run way over time, so I think we're going to conclude on that note. Next week will be our final session in this class. We're going to be talking about human beings and the scientific evidence pertaining to the nature of humanity, not just the origins of human beings, but the nature of human beings as well. And we'll be talking about that, and that'll be the end of our course on science and the Bible. And don't forget, 2 weeks from tonight at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll begin a new elective for the theology program on the historical Jesus, and I look forward to that as well. Thanks, everybody, and hope I'll see you here next week.